Good evening. It is my pleasure to welcome each and every one of you to the 4th Annual Stone Book Award. My name is Leon Wilson, President and CEO of the Museum of African American History. But before we get started, I'd like to send a special thank you to Jim and Kathy Stone and the Stone Foundation for their continued support and partnership, without whom this joyous award would not be possible. The Stone Book Award is an annual prize that encourages scholarship and writing within the field of African American history and culture. And this year, it just got bigger. This year, we received 94 submissions, the most submissions to date. Great job, jurors, getting through all those amazing submissions. Thank you so much. This year, we also increased the award to $50,000 to the winner and $10,000 for the finalists. We are very delighted. The museum's focus has been and remains to be to foster community engagement and dialogue centered around these incredible new literary works. And also to imagine a better future is vital to stress the necessity of re-examining history and inspire future scholarly writing in the field. The museum is committed to celebrating authors whose works inform and inspire us. Authors like Dr. Daphne Brooks, this year's award winner, who wrote an extraordinary book, Liner Notes for the Revolution, the Intellectual Life of Black Feminist Sound. And our two finalists, Dr. Dan Royals, author of To Make the Wounded Whole, the African American Struggle Against HIV/AIDS, and Dr. Walter Johnson, author of The Broken Heart of America, St. Louis, and the Violent History of the United States. With the current racial reckoning happening across our country, stories like these can help to bridge the understanding and expose untold truths in American history. The Museum of African American History, Boston, and Nantucket's exhibits, programs, and educational activities showcase the powerful stories of Black families who worshiped, educated their children, debated the issues of the day, produced great art, organized politically, and advanced the cause of freedom. I encourage you to visit our historic sites in Boston and Nantucket, and to be inspired to learn more about the small but mighty abolitionist community that played a critical role in shaping American history. And now, I'd like to introduce Victoria Reggie Kennedy, co-founder and president of the board of the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate. Take it away, Victoria.
Thank you, Leon Wilson, and thank you for your leadership at the Museum of African American History. The Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate is so honored to partner again with the museum and the Stone Foundation for this year's MAAH Book Award. In addition to educating the public about the important role of the Senate in our system of government, the Kennedy Institute is dedicated to inspiring the next generation of citizens and leaders to engage in the civic life of their communities. This exciting book award and the books and authors who are being recognized this afternoon certainly do inspire. We couldn't be more delighted to be part of this wonderful event. It is now my great pleasure to turn the program over to my friend Kathy Stone. Along with her husband, Jim, and the Stone Foundation, Kathy is making such a positive difference for our community, a positive difference in our country every single day. What an honor it is to work with her and to introduce her now. Kathy, take it away.
Thank you, Vicki. I'm Kathy Stone. I'm president of the Stone Foundation, and I'm a member of the Book Award Honorary Committee. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight at the awards ceremony that my husband Jim and I are so proud to be associated with. While we very much looked forward to all being together at the African Meeting House in Boston, we have a benefit from going virtual, and that is that we've been able to make contact with people all across the country in many cities and towns. So thank you all for joining us and being part of our celebration, ever expanding, of the role of African American history and culture in the United States. But we have a terrific program ahead of us, but before we go to that program, I want to take a minute to thank some people. First of all, to our jurors. There must have been near 94 submissions this year, and our 5 jurors took a great deal of time and attention to come up with the winners that we celebrate tonight. To our authors, thank you for writing with such passion and depth about a diverse range of topics, and for sharing this work with us and the community at large. And finally, to Pam Waterman, who runs the whole show of the Book Award, and her colleague Michelle Samplin Salgado, who provides the graphics. The two of you together have made this a memorable award, and we thank you very much for all the work you've done, and thank you again for what you might do in the future. So it's now my pleasure to pass on the mic to our hostess tonight, Callie Crosley, who is a highly regarded journalist, commentator on race and politics, and currently running her own show on Boston's WGBH. So, Callie, take it away.
Good evening. I'm so excited to be here to welcome all of you. We're here live, and I'm very excited that in just a little while, I'll be talking to our winning author, Daphne A. Brooks. Now, I know some of you might want to offer her some questions toward the end of our conversation, but you don't have to wait to do that. You can drop it in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. You'll see the icon at any time during the program, and we'll try to get to as many as we can toward the end of our conversation. So I welcome you to do that now or later, however you wish. But first, let's hear from members of the honorary committee and from our jurors about our finalists.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dana Williams, and I am Dean of the Graduate School at Howard University and Professor of African American Literature. I have the great pleasure of being a juror for this year's MAAH Stone Book Award.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Charles McKinney, Jr. I'm an Associate Professor of History and the Director of Africana Studies at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee, and I'm also very honored to be a Stone Book Award juror.
There were so many things that we liked about this book, high among them the way that it really does reorient our way of thinking about structural racism in America. By no means was it an easy read. There were really compelling stories that were heart-wrenching at every chapter. But that's also part of what made the book really special for us as jurors, because there were memorable moments that really cut at the heart of how we think about the American story. Another thing that was really interesting about this book that worked well and that was really important was the way that it really does redirect our understanding of capitalism and racial capitalism and its relevance in America. Too often we hear stories where history does not really pay attention to the kind of impulse that capitalism creates, everything from greed to violence, to really just disrupting our way of thinking about what America is. This book puts all of that on notice, that no longer will we continue to tell those stories without being very honest about the crippling effects of capitalism in America, but also about the ways that it informs American imperialism.
One of the things that I was struck by with this book is the way in which Johnson takes history seriously. The way in which one of the reviewers talked about this granular history reveals so much to us, not just about that city, but about the totality of American history. And so then when we read a book like Johnson's, we understand that the murder of Michael Brown is not a flashpoint. It is not. It is not an event that is separate and disconnected from larger contexts, larger realities. So, why was Michael Brown murdered? That's a really complicated question, and here's a really complicated answer to that question. Right? Walter Johnson tells us that in order for us to understand that particular moment in time, we have to go back 300 years. And we have to understand the architecture of anti-Blackness. We have to understand the realities of our deep investment in Indian removal and the subordination of indigenous people. We have to understand the structures and architectures of capitalism. And so we have to understand those things over the course of 300 years, over the course of centuries, to then understand why Michael Brown can be murdered in Ferguson. And so Johnson's book, this is a hard book to read. It's in graduate school, we would call this book a slog, right? But it's a brilliant book, and it's a book that really reveals, again, in the title, the broken heart of America.
As jurors, we also talked quite a bit about the way that this book did not necessarily center Black people. And, quite candidly, that was really complicated for us, because for this prize in particular, we wanted Black people to be at the center of the narrative, to be the operators in the narrative, to be the protagonists of our own story. But then we also thought about the ways that this book forces us to think about what we've all been calling for, the kind of anti-racist teaching, the kind of anti-Blackness realities, that it is the responsibility of white scholars to do that kind of work. This is one of those books that meets the challenge that we were all calling for, not just in history in a general sense, not just in American history, not just in African American studies, when white allies ask very often, what is it that we can do? The Broken Heart of America is the kind of book that does that work, that says, we will not let systemic racism off the hook. We will not let people who have been depicted as white heroes for so many years off the hook. We will look at them square on and really show the ways that subtle racism, passive white actors have really enacted violence, whether or not it was the literal taking of a stick or if it was quiet participants in what they knew were very racial and racialized systems. So the way that we thought about this book too, and Charles, I'd be really interested in hearing more from you about what we imagined this book as an example of, in terms of the work that scholarship about Black life, where Black life isn't centered, but it is really a part of the conversation to show us and to teach us how many of the things that we know as Black people have been imposed upon us, but the way that white people can see for themselves, the ways that they have also enacted certain acts of violence. Just to talk just a little bit more about how we thought about this book and why it was important for this book to get the kind of attention that we know it will get as a result of earning this prize.
Right. That's a great question. I think one of the things if we want to really boil it down, what Johnson is doing in this book is that he takes Black life seriously.
Absolutely.
And so again, you're right, we grappled with this dynamic in which, Black folk aren't necessarily central to the analysis. They aren't centered, they aren't front and center in the way that Johnson has done in other books of his. But what he does is, when he takes Black life seriously, right, he is then able to take anti-Blackness seriously. And then with a critique, with his structural and institutional critiques, when he takes Black lives seriously, then we can see that these actions that are taken on the part of, white heroes, these actions have consequences. And these actions, when they are taken in the context of anti-Blackness, right, anti-Blackness begets anti-Blackness, right? And so this is what happens when you take Black people seriously. This is what happens when you take the systems and structures that for decades, for centuries, we've been told were benign and neutral. This is what happens basically when you tell the truth, right? About the nature of American institutions, and about what American institutions are structurally designed to do. right? You know, this ongoing conversation about whether or not the system is working or the system is broken. And every once in a while, you see somebody jump up and say, well, the system's doing exactly what it's designed to do, right? This is an example of that, right? You know, these systems weren't broken, right? The federal government had an explicit interest in removing indigenous people from this land, full stop. Right? That's not accidental. That's not unfortunate. That's not collateral damage. That is one of the central operating principles, right? Over the totality of American history. And Johnson's not afraid of that. We see that playing out in this book, and we see the convergences, right? In terms of how anti-Blackness and Indian removal, right? And the removal of indigenous people. We see the conflation. We see how those two things merge, right? We see how those dynamics merge, and we also see how those dynamics, right? This isn't an unfortunate byproduct, right? You know, this wasn't accidentally cooked up by some lower level executive in the Bureau of Land Management or whatever.
Yeah, right.
Right?
It's a deliberate act.
This is the project. This is the work. They have land. We want the land. We will get rid of them, and then we will bring in Europeans and the people that they own in order to clear this land, right? So again, he's given it to us straight. And he's showing us that these structural and institutional and cultural and economic actions have consequences, and those consequences are firmly rooted in the dynamics of anti-Blackness.
What we felt ultimately is that if there is indeed any remedy or repair for this American project, the broken heart of America is something that must be confronted before we can move forward. Congratulations to Dr. Walter Johnson for a job well done and for winning the second prize for The Broken Heart of America.
Hi, I'm Walter Johnson. I'm Walter and Mary Angela Johnson's son from Columbia, Missouri, and I'm really glad and grateful to be here with you tonight, even virtually so. Thanks first to the Museum of African American History and the prize committee, and congratulations to Daphne Brooks, bold, brilliant, and full of fun. Thanks to my mentors, Nell Painter, Robin Kelly, George Lipsitz, David Roediger, Lisa Lowe, and Cornell West. Thanks to my colleagues, especially Vince Brown, Tommy Shelby, Elizabeth Hinton, Stephanie Smallwood, Samuel Moyne, and Kirsten Weld. Thanks to my editor, Brian Distelberg, my agent, Sandy Dykstra, and my research assistant, Mark Lohr. Thanks to my wife, Allison, who was the first person to tell me I should write a book about St. Louis and who kept saying it until I finally agreed. She's my morning star. Thanks to my kids, whose clarity and morality I've come to treasure. They remind me why the world is worth fighting for. And about their future, I have so many hopes and so many terrible fears. I started off writing this book in the fall of 2014, and I, like all the rest of us who care about justice, owe everything to the people who turned out into the streets in St. Louis that summer, and then again in the summer of 2020. I've learned so much more from activists and community organizers in St. Louis than I could ever hope to give back. I don't want to sound too smarmy, but it's hard for me to find the words to describe some of the things that I've learned because they're more like revelations, like shifts in my axis of vision than things that I can put into words. There are some moments and relationships that have distilled that for me. I learned from the journalist and organizer Sylvester Brown when he said, "People say we're poor, but we're rich. Look at our children." I learned from Mackler Shepard, who founded an organization that repossessed and rebuilt houses on the north side of St. Louis in the late 1970s, that an educated person is someone who can go anywhere in a society, from the top to the bottom, and not embarrass themselves and not embarrass anyone else. Although I've spent enough time close to the top to add, except when they deserve it. I learned from Nicole Nelson and Kalila Jackson, organizers working on a project trying to get relief for poor people in Centerville, Illinois, where there's both endemic flooding and constant sewage backup, who would let the best idea in the world wither on the vine if its picking had not been approved by the people of Centerville assembled to talk it through. I learned from Aaron Williams, who works on cultural preservation and community building in one of the historical centers of Black St. Louis, that the work moves at the speed of trust. I learned from Jahari Jabir and Jabiri Asim that for those who live there, Pruitt-Igoe was just another place, that human flourishing abides within historical injustice, and that it is equally important to remember. I learned from the artist and designer Dee Nichols and the museum director Lois Conley that the stories people tell you are precious and that you shouldn't take them and use them without leaving something tangible and durable in exchange. More than anything, I learned about politics, solidarity, radical hospitality, and revolutionary love from Tef Poe, Percy Green, and Jamala Rogers, who showed me the city of St. Louis, told me what they had learned from it, and vouched for me as I made my way. In closing, I urge you to learn from St. Louis, to read Derica Purnell's Becoming Abolitionists, and to follow Cori Bush, to Google the Metropolitan Equal Housing Opportunity Council, the Griot Museum, the Arch City Defenders, Action St. Louis, the Organization for Black Struggle, and Black Men Build. Find out about their work and figure out how you can support it. Thank you very much. Good night.
Good evening. My name is William Sturkey, and I am an associate professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And it is my great pleasure to introduce one of the two finalists for the 2021 MAAH Stone Book Award, Dan Royals, To Make the Wounded Whole, The African American Struggle Against HIV/AIDS.
And good evening, everyone. My name is Jarvis Givens, and I'm a professor of education in African and African American studies at Harvard University. And I'm excited to join my colleague, Professor Sturkey, to discuss To Make the Wounded Whole, the African American Struggle Against HIV and AIDS by Professor Dan Royals. And, you know, one of the things that's important to note is that the public has long been aware that Black people are disproportionately impacted by the HIV/AIDS epidemic. But little attention has been given to the consistent work of African American AIDS activists consistently struggling against the structural causes and consequences of poverty, marginalization, and disempowerment that have always been at the root of this epidemic as it spread internationally. But with this book, To Make the Wounded Whole, Professor Royals corrects that omission by tracing the work of various organizations and activists from the 1980s through the first decade of the 21st century. And there were a number of things that were really striking to us about this text. And I want to turn it back over to Professor Sturkey to say a bit about some of the things that came up in our deliberations.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that really struck me with this book was, it really caught my attention right in the introduction, because, you know, Royals points out that Belgrade, Florida had the highest rate of AIDS on the planet Earth. And I was just really stunned by that, but it was really good entrance into how African-American communities dealt with this pandemic. And it was so striking because he really shined a light on activists that were fighting against incredible odds, people that were marginalized in society because they were often gay and they were Black. There were even people that were marginalized in Black communities because they were gay, and marginalized in gay communities because they were Black. And so a lot of these people had to work within very challenging structures or create their own in order to help promote the cause of people fighting to live with HIV and AIDS.
Yeah, and Professor Royals identified key themes that seem to run throughout the work of these various African-American AIDS activists. These grassroots organizers developed approaches that were tailored specifically to Black communities and that were culturally competent. They partnered with institutions that they knew to be deeply entrenched in African-American communities, and they worked to address social determinants of health that made Black people distinctly vulnerable to the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And the selection committee also really appreciated in doing this work and telling the story of these activists, the way that Professor Royals placed this story in conversation with other Black scholars who've been writing about race, justice, and medicine, including scholars like Alondra Nelson and Celeste Watkin Hayes, but also scholars who have offered more expansive conceptual resources for thinking about sexuality and queer identity in particular as it pertains to Black political life, particularly scholars like Kathy Cohen that seem to have been instrumental in terms of the kind of framing and conceptualizing of this story and the way that the story is told by Professor Royals.
One of the most impressive things to me as a judge was the way that Professor Royals captured the incredibly diverse range of activities that HIV and AIDS rights activists were performing to help gay Black communities and to help all sorts of Black communities that were touched by the HIV pandemic. And a lot of this had to do with the unique concerns of Black communities as they encountered the HIV pandemic. And of course, these have to do with family culture, traditional Black ghettos and the crack pandemic at the same time, but then different issues of class, bisexuality, or all these different things that were unique to the Black communal experience of HIV and AIDS that I think really shaped the way that activists organized. And one of the things that I really admired too was the way that Royals talked about this sort of blend between activism, education, and culture. So you have to make sure that your activism is often taking the shape of educating people through cultural events and products, like videos, for example, that taught people about what HIV was, how to contract it, how to avoid it, and so on and so forth.
Right. And one other thing that I wanted to lift up that I found to be very important about this text, in addition to it, speaking in very important ways to the current moment as we're living through a pandemic and many of the kind of social determinants of health impacting Black communities as it pertains to the AIDS epidemic, also kind of carrying over, and we see kind of the resonance with the current moment when it comes to COVID-19. But Dan Royals, in recognizing the self-determination among Black AIDS activists, is clear not to let the state off the hook for its aggressive neglect of Black communities as it pertains to this health crisis, as well as many others. Professor Royals names that, like other neoliberal turns in governmentality of recent decades, how the state directly and indirectly offloaded the responsibility of health and social services onto the very communities that were most harmed by the deliberate unraveling of the social safety net since the Reagan era. So I appreciated this balance of both telling the story of these activists on the ground engaging in this grassroots work, but at the same time engaging and offering a kind of structural critique of the kind of neglect that conditioned the kind of emergence of this widespread epidemic and the way that it impacted vulnerable communities the most in the ways that it did, and making clear that that's also a part of this story.
One of my favorite things about this book too was that this was clearly a labor of love that involved a lot of intensive research from all sorts of different sources. There's a richness in this work, whether you're talking about Black organizers in Philadelphia or the Nation of Islam and the Black Church, and even part of this global Black struggle to deal with HIV and AIDS as activists in the United States of America are organizing to help people living with HIV and AIDS in Africa. And there was just an incredible richness in terms of the diversity of sources that Royals was able to employ in this very important story.
Right. So we enjoyed reading the text and enjoyed learning about this important piece in African American history. And we want to celebrate and congratulate Professor Dan Royals on an excellent work and for being a finalist for this year's Stone Book Award for African American History and Culture.
Hi, everyone. I want to start by saying what an honor it is to be recognized alongside two fantastic scholars in our field, Daphne Brooks and Walter Johnson. And I want to thank everyone at the Museum of African American History, and especially those who served on the Stone Book Award Prize Committee, for taking the time to read so much great new work in our field to narrow it down to these three books. This book, To Make the Wounded Whole, started as my dissertation when I was a graduate student at Temple University. And so I want to start by thanking my dissertation advisor, Beth Bailey, for pushing me at every stage of this project to make it better. And one piece of advice that she gave me over and over was to have people do things as I was writing. And by that she meant to put people at the center of the stories that I was telling. And I think that's a really important piece of advice for us as historians, not only in terms of telling better stories or doing better storytelling, but in terms of keeping human agency at the center of the stories that we tell. I really could not have asked for a better mentor or a better person to teach me about how to write history, so I really just owe her a tremendous debt of gratitude. And I want to thank the other members of my dissertation committee as well, David Farber, Bryant Simon, Heather Thompson, Aladra Nelson. Each of them is just a fantastic mentor in their own right, and I'm so deeply grateful to them as well. I want to thank everyone at UNC Press. I want to thank Heather Thompson again, along with Rhonda Williams, as series editors for the Justice, Power, and Politics series. And I want to thank Brendan Proya, my editor, who believed in this book so much from the moment that I sent him a book proposal back in 2015. I want to thank everyone who shared their story with me in the process of researching and writing this book, but especially Rashida Abdul Khabir, Pernessa Seal, Wahida Shabazel, and Dazen Dixon Diallo, as well as those whose stories appeared in the book but who didn't get to see its publication. Reggie Williams, John Bell, Curtis Waldington. So to everyone who was so generous with their time and with their stories, I thank you. I want to thank everyone who supported me along the way. My parents, Ed and Melanie, my wonderful husband, Darwin, who I love very much and who saw me through the end of the writing and publication process. And finally, I want to thank our dog, Rocky, who has brought so much joy into our lives. You're a very good boy, and we love you very much. So thanks to everybody for attending tonight. I hope you really enjoy the book.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lee Rayford, and I am professor of African and African Diaspora Studies at University of California, Berkeley. I am very grateful to be a member of the committee of jurors with my esteemed colleagues Jarvis Givens, Charles McKinney, William Stuckey, and Dana Williams for the fourth Stone Book Award. It is a joy to read together with such a fabulous group of scholars. And it is my great honor and privilege to introduce this year's Stone Book Award winner, Liner Notes for the Revolution, The Intellectual Life of Black Feminist Sound by Daphne A. Brooks. Brooks's Liner Notes for the Revolution is a sweeping embrace of a book that tells the many stories of how Black women musicians made modern popular music and thus made U.S. culture. Brooks understands Black women cultural laborers as intellectuals, musicians who theorize sound, carving a path to artistic truth and freedom beyond the limited parameters set for them within a racist, patriarchal culture industry. To fully appreciate the innovations of women like Mamie Smith, Tina Turner, Grace Jones, Janelle Monáe, Beyonce, and so many more, Brooks asserts that we must also take seriously the community of care and regard for Black women's music cultivated by other Black women intellectuals. Thus, alongside consideration of the craft of Black women performers, producers, and songwriters, Liner Notes pays loving attention to the music criticism of Zorinelle Hurston and Lorraine Hansberry, the curatorial work of collectors, the imaginative work of artists like Toni Morrison and Carrie Mae Weems, and the sustaining work of listeners like the author's own mother, Miss Juanita Watson Brooks, Black girls and women who've created their own criteria for evaluation in critical communities of enjoyment. Everyone has a part to play in the revolution that is Black women sounding out the value of Black life. Our finalist shortlist this year included 5 books that offered new thinking in Black music history and criticism, which I think is a testament to the strength and importance of the field of sound studies in this moment. What impressed our jury about Liner Notes is not only its ambitious scope, its generous, sensuous, and ebullient writing, it's a joy to read, and its archival deep cuts to tell the story of how Black women make modern sound. But the jury, we were perhaps most impressed by the way Brooks shows us how to write this history. And in doing so, expands our very notions of what African American history is and can be. History, Brooks reminds us, is made equally in the everyday choices of everyday people, as well as in the grand actions of notable figures. History is in the ways they pursue their pleasures, nurse their sorrows, and imagine better for themselves. Black history, Brooks demonstrates for us, is not just found in newspapers, speeches, autobiographies, and other traditional sources tucked away in institutional archives, those archives from which Black women especially have largely been excluded. Rather, Black history is found in the myriad creative ways Black people have written, visualized, and sounded themselves into recognition. Black feminist history, Brooks gloriously asserts, is not the story of the singular hero, but of the chorus, an assembly committed to collaboration, conversation, and the choreography of new ways of living. And to write Black history, Black feminist history, Brooks intones us, requires a listening ear attuned to the revolutions that happen on the lowest frequencies, as well as those that arrive as epic anthems. Brooks shows us then that Black history is always potential history, not just the story of what was, but of what might have been and what could still be. Thank you, Daphne Brooks, for this gift of a book that offers us a history of collaborative freedom dreaming.
Good evening. I am Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot, professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and chair of the Museum of African American History Stone Book Award Honorary Committee. I want to offer my congratulations to Daphne A. Brooks for her masterful and illuminating winning work. Liner Notes for the Revolution, the Intellectual Life of Black Feminist Sound. What a provocative, poetic title that immediately lures you into reading the book. I also want to say hallelujah to the two finalists, Dan Royals and Walter Johnson, for their wonderful and revelatory contributions to the literature. And of course, I want to express my deep gratitude to the jurors for their hard work, rigor, discernment, and excellent judgment.
Well, it's our time now, Professor Brooks, you and me. I'm delighted to have this conversation for all of the guests here tonight because your book, as many in the chat have written, is a delight to read. And I hope that everybody gets a chance to read it. I want to start very simply, though. Liner notes for the revolution. What are liner notes for those who may not be familiar with the term or really what it stands for?
Thank you, Callie Crossley. My 95-year-old mother is on the line, and so I know she would scold me if I didn't take just a smidgen of a moment in the short time that we have to extend some thank yous to Jim and Kathy Stone, to President Leon Wilson, to Professor Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot, to the committee, the jurors who put so much labor and time and energy and care into the work of reading this extraordinary, body of knowledge that we're producing in this moment. So Lee Rayford, Dana Williams, Charles McKenney, Jarvis Givens, William Sturkey, as Chris Rock would say, you get the big piece of chicken because it's just a labor of love, and you are a fantastic ensemble of brilliant scholars in and of your own right. I also want to just momentarily stress that I'm especially grateful to Professor Rayford for making such kind and generous and moving comments about my work. She's truly one of my intellectual heroes. She's a beacon of light and innovative, transformative scholarly activism at my beloved alma mater, UC Berkeley, and based in the dynamic and forward-thinking Black Studies community at Berkeley. So thank you so much. And then finally, I have to also acknowledge my extraordinary fellow authors who produce new work in African American history and Black Studies more broadly. So as we continue to navigate our global state of emergency on multiple fronts, I'm inspired by the fearless thinking, the risk-taking and experimentation of my fellow scholars who are digging and documenting and analyzing and producing narratives that enable us to reckon with our past and to imagine new futures. There's so much extraordinary work that Black Studies scholars are doing right now in such a rich and robust variety of contexts. I'm humbled to be in that company. And really, finally, I want to acknowledge the brilliant work of my colleagues, Professor Walter Johnson and Professor Dan Royals. Walter Johnson has been a hero to me on many fronts, especially as a writer and a thinker and historian. So it's a thrill to be able to see and hear him tonight. and to also fet Professor Royals as he produces this monograph that is sure to transform our thinking on so many fronts, especially as we navigate this most recent pandemic. So thank you for leading us in this ethical revolution and using Black studies to transform the world and to remind us of our civic responsibilities as intellectuals in the world. Thank you. So Callie Crossley, to answer your question, what are liner notes? If you notice the gray hair, this should mark everything that has to do with my knowledge of liner notes, since they are much a relic of the past in the sense that they literally were the lining produced on vinyl records beginning in the 1930s and 40s, especially by the mid 20th century. They're the text that is produced on the linings of the vinyl records by producers, sometimes by musicians themselves, by journalists, to frame the way in which the consumer, the listener, experiences the music for the first time and forever after. So it's a kind of writing that runs alongside of the recording itself. And I wanted to pay tribute to that form, to also think about the Black feminist creatives who have utilized the form and have gone unappreciated, and to also imagine the ways in which the form itself might be a kind of portal through which we could interrogate the long and deeply marginalized history of Black women musicians' contributions to making our modern world.
So say more about that, because you've redefined what liner notes are in the context of your book and in this history, what you call the secret history of Black women's sounds, the intellectual labor that engages those sounds.
Yeah. So, I mean, labor was crucial to me as a student of Black studies, and as someone who, was raised on Cedric Robinson alongside of so many other Black radical tradition thinkers. I wanted to make sure that we paid attention to the actual work of Black artists within the culture industry. But I also wanted to think about the ways in which lining itself is a kind of a physical form of work that's associated with in the arc of industrialization in this country and beyond. It's associated with a kind of structural work that goes into building the foundations of our modern culture. And so when we talk about lining labor, we're often talking about railroad structures, that how you line out the infrastructure, a word very much in our modern vocabulary right now, how you line out the infrastructure of modern conditions in our felt world. African American workers, we know, for a variety of reasons, from convict lease labor to marginalized access to forms of employment, were funneled into these kinds of hard forms of physical labor. And in the process, they created culture. The work songs that we think of by way of folk artists like the great Odetta were songs that were often improvised and created along the railroad lines in the process of lining out. So I wanted to pay attention to the kind of dualities of labor that come by way of lining, and to think about how there is a kind of discursive written form of lining as well, historical lining, that a number of intellectuals have been doing to keep track, pun intended, of the genius musicality that's become the soundtrack to our contemporary world.
So this is very much a scholarly treatise of your premise, but we have to take a moment to point out that you know music. You are a music aficionado. You know rock and roll, you know the blues. You may not be in Beyonce's Bayhive, but you know what it is, and you can navigate. So how did you decide, how did you pull together? What was a moment that you thought, there's something here more to be explored than just, as I deeply enjoy this music, but there's a thread that I can pull together. What was the moment that brought that all together for you?
Oh my goodness. I mean, I often describe the path to this book as having something to do with being the youngest in a much older family. My parents escaped the Jim Crow South in 1950. to resettle in Berkeley, where my father studied history and then education. He and my mother were HBCU grads who ended up becoming public educators in the San Francisco Bay Area. They had 2 children in the 50s and thought they were done, and then along I came at the end of the 60s, and that meant that I got archives of Black sound across the generations in my household. But I'm also a post-civil rights baby, so I was attending school in integrated spaces and absorbing a heterogeneous array of sounds, some of which had no place in my home, like punk rock music. So what am I going to do but take the bus to Tower Records and explore the music on my own and find my way to rock music criticism so I could have conversations with someone about the sounds that I was trying to figure out. At the same time, I had a sister who's 10 years older than me who was attending Mills College and in the run of the Black feminist literary renaissance in the 1970s and giving me dog-eared copies of Toni Morrison and Alice Walker and Ntozake Shange, probably when I was just a little bit too young for those books, but that combination of Black feminist knowledge production and popular music culture that was the wallpaper to my life, were dialectically, in conversation with one another. But I will also say, and this is just ripped from the headlines yesterday and today, I've been getting calls from the press about the fact that the Rolling Stones yesterday pulled from their catalog, finally, after 50 years, the song Brown Sugar, which is about the systemic rape of Black women in slavery and the pleasures, the putative pleasures within the song that come about as a result of that kind of catastrophic violence. So I've been asked to comment on that. And I've talked about the ways in which, that music, the anti-Blackness and misogyny of that music was something that I had to wrestle with. And even as I was drawn to it, and Black feminist theory and Black feminist history gave me the language and the critical lexicon to tackle those sounds and to try to produce meaning about those sounds. And then to think about the ways in which all of these extraordinary artists were able to create their own counter meaning in the face of that kind of quotidian violence.
I'd like our audience to hear just a little bit of your words on the page. And this is taken from your extremely beautiful introduction, which you spend a lot of time getting us ready for the rest of the book. So give us a little sample.
Happy to do that. Liner notes for the revolution is thus no history in any conventional sense of the word. Like critic Hazel Carby, who once famously distanced herself from the Black feminist theoretical impulse to rely on a common or shared experience in exploring the work of Black women writers, I do not set my sights on excavating a tradition of Black women's musical aesthetics. I do, however, pursue the idea of Black women musicians and entertainers as socio-cultural intellectuals and as archives of cultural memory. I focus on the ways that cultural critics, scholars, and collectors emerge as integral figures in the production of Black women's sonic cultures and their discontents. And I aim to tell a twofold story of how an array of daring Black women artists engaged with historical memory and fragments of Black folks' sociocultural past through sound, and of how these same artists innovated their own distinct and innovative modes of critical practice within Black sound. The flip side of this story focuses on the ways that critics and record collectors have documented and produced divergent knowledges about Black women artists and devised very particular ways of reading their work. The juxtaposition of these two worlds, that of the musicians and that of the critics, is crucial here because at its heart, this book insists that Black women's popular music culture, sound archives, music critics, and collectors are deeply entangled with one another, and that Black women musicians have strategized myriad path-breaking ways to navigate said entanglements. The story of these women cannot be told without paying attention to the white and mostly male critics and the archives that documented their lives and work, but were just as prone to forgetting them.
Yay. Now I want to go from there to highlight a couple of the people in your book who have done this work. One of them I was surprised to find out about, Zorinelle Hurston. We think of her as the novelist. We think of her as the, somewhat radical, I'm using air quotes now, writer. But I was vaguely familiar with her travels through the South, but not this very specific work around music. Would you speak to that, please? Set it up for us.
Absolutely. So what we're about to listen to is the briefest of snippets of a recording made by that iconic Harlem Renaissance polymath, which is what she absolutely was, Zorinelle Hurston, during her WPA fieldwork expedition in June of 1939 in Jacksonville, Florida. Hurston is one of the figures in my book whose story I wanted to tell from a slightly different perspective, precisely because of what you're suggesting, Callie, about a certain familiarity with her, especially in relation to her 1937 classic novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is now lauded, rightly so, as one of the greatest Black feminist novels of all time. She was a sister, though, who wore many hats as a playwright, an anthropologist, a cultural critic, a performer. And if we look to the work that she did, particularly in the 30s, as an ethnographer who remained fiercely committed to identifying and narrating at the granular level, the value of Black vernacular culture as an indispensable form of self-making and survival for the dispossessed, then it becomes possible to read her labor as indicative of the kind of intellectual revolution that I set out to trace in the book. So Hurston traveled the global South. She did this in order to gather up the material traces of everyday Black expressive life, and especially musical and performative life, and to really intricately narrate the meaning of its worth, and by extension, the meaning of Black folks' worth. And she did this through her own performative practices and through the recording technologies that were available to her and her WPA team in 1939. So what we're going to hear right now is just a brief example of all of this. This is Hurston first introducing the song Mule on the Mount to her colleagues at the Federal Music Project Office in Jacksonville, followed by the briefest of clips of her singing a verse from the song, just to give you a taste of what she sounded like if people aren't familiar with Zorinelle Hurston, the vocalist, which is very distinct in some ways.
This song I'm going to sing is a line and rhythm, and I'm going to call it Mule on the Mount, though you can start with any verse you want and give it a name. And it's the most widely distributed work song in the United States. And it has innumerable verses and whatnot about everything under the sun. And it's a line and rhythm, though they sometimes sing it just sitting around the juke houses and doing any kind of work at all, chopping wood and in the lumber camps and everywhere you find this song. Nowhere you can't find parts of this song, Mule on the Mount. I got a rainbow wrapped and tied around my shoulder. I got a rainbow wrapped and tied around my shoulder. It looked like rain, Lord, Lord, it looked like rain.
That's great. I love that.
I mean, completely unvarnished singer, we have to say, right?
Exactly.
And I think that's actually significant. I do want to thank Professors Werner Solers and Glenda Carpio for many years ago, they invited me to first listen to Zorinelle Hurston's recording, and I'm just so grateful to them. And I just want to stress that there's so much compelling information in this brief excerpt. We have Hurston, of course, referencing the fact that this particular song is one of those lining rhythms, so those vernacular work songs improvisationally produced by Black laborers to accompany, to collaboratively bear out and make sustainable and manageable the arduous and often excruciating physical work of building railroads. In her field work, Hurston engaged with a range of day laborers, particularly African-American men working not only on railroads, but in the Florida turpentine industry, an extremely brutal type of work that was subject to many fatalities. So she noted the intricacies of songs that both catalog the work and also conveyed the complex inner life worlds and desires of the laborers that exceeds the work. And we can even hear that in that little snippet. So we hear her pointing out the fact that Mule on the Mount is the most widely distributed work song in the United States. So she's noting for her audience Black Sound's massive capacity to operate as an apparatus of mobile expression, its crucial role in alternative world making for marginalized communities suffering from exploitative labor practices. She does a little bit of flexing. Nowhere can you find parts of this, can you not find parts of this song, Mule on the Mount? So she's really emphasizing the power of Black diasporic communities recognizing themselves to one another through cultural forms, through a range of cultural and aesthetic practices that were dense and sophisticated and that serve as proof that Black cultural life is prodigious and formidable and historically and regionally informed rather than empty of meaning and worth and value. It has its own lexicon, theories, ideologies attached to it. This was her intellectual life's work. And so then you get that final luminous verse, I got a rainbow wrapped and tied around my shoulder. So this is a line that the Hurston biographer Valerie Boyd uses for the title of her celebrated, really gorgeous book, Wrapped in Rainbows, about Hurston's life. I wanted us to hear Hurston singing that line from this song that traveled the Black U.S. regional diaspora so broadly in order to hear her insisting that we could get a sense of the kind of everyday poetry of Black vernacular forms that Hurston calls attention to in her recorded performances. And it matters. It matters that she's not a phenomenal singer, that she's an amateur. It reminds us of how sonic lyricism enabled a range of Black community members to cultivate poetry, to envision the sumptuous ways of managing the world and being in the world in spite of the anti-Black conditions of the Jim Crow every day. So Hurston recorded that. And she also wrote these essays, that amount to what I see and as being the kind of modern form of liner notes for her own sonic material that she was producing for the WPA.
Well, I think that the audience can hear what they will get in your book because you have so much fine detail around all of the people that you've identified who have contributed in ways. Some names I did not know at all. I feel embarrassed about that. And some that I did know, I didn't know the richness of the experience and of their contribution, as you've just shared with about Zorinelle Hurston. Now, I don't want to run out of time without getting you to contemporary artists, because there is a through line that you have from the book spans from the 1920s to 2016, 2017. And we need to let everybody know that you've got something to say about what shows up with those younger women, the ones that we are experiencing right now. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, the book ends with an epilogue that I actually wrote in New Orleans originally. It ends with a focus on lemonade. And one of the things that I like to acknowledge, and I believe that Professor Rayford made allusion to this, so I'm moved by that, is that I really do always want to situate my work in the chorus, as the great Saidiya Hartman would say. And so there are a number of critics who are doing incredible work on Beyonce's Lemonade in particular, which I allude to in the book as arguably the most critically reviewed album of all time because of the way that mass technology works at this point. And again, rightly so in terms of the kind of the magnitude of the history that she takes on in this formidable visual album. But I wrote it in New Orleans originally, this piece, with a mind and an eye towards thinking about geography as it manifests itself sonically as well as visually in the text. The ways in which also to think about her recording as doing a kind of work that's on par with something like Dylan's Basement Tapes, which has received
quite a bit of conversation.
Generations of focus from rock music critics. But if we understand the ways in which there's a kind of radical subterranean way in which centuries of history are crystallized within that text, then we can get closer to understanding the complexities of Black women's musicality and the ways in which they've used sound as an archive of our historical memory and as a way to imagine our futures as well.
So you've said liner notes for the revolution. So what is the revolution?
Yeah. It runs on two axes. It's both sonic in terms of experimentation. I've always said that if we were able to write the history of popular music in this country through the prism of 1619, then we really have to take seriously how every note made by a Black musician is a revolution in and of itself, to the extent that it's an instantiation of Black life and Black humanity, one's own imprint that one can author, about oneself, one's own imprint that one can leave on our felt universe. So it's both aesthetic and performative. It's also intellectual in the sense that there is something deeply radical about knowledge production. I mean, this prize, the Stone Prize, in and of itself, I think, pays tribute to that. And the fact that we have traditions, over a century's worth, at least print discourse produced by Black women and their allies about the value of their own art, their own expressive art. That's the kind of revolution that has not been captured yet in any kind of a book. And I wanted to pay tribute to that.
I can't emphasize enough. Some did what the professor did in leading into talking about the essence of your book, that the writing is fantastic. So let me pick one of my favorite passages so I can share with the audience. You're talking about Janelle Monáe. Think Ziggy Stardust crossed with Octavia Butler. Think Black abolitionist Henry Box Brown and the cross-dressing Ellen Craft, all mixed up ever so gloriously with Grace Jones and LaBelle. Monáe's highly literary, cinematic, and sonic fugitive plan is inspired yet carefully conceived Afro outsider art for the 21st century. Well, you just go on, Professor Book, because that is something. Let me tell you.
Thank
One
you,
last
Kelly
question.
Can I just say, it's just about writing to meet the music on the playing field of its excellence and richness. That's all it is. It's just trying to honor the art.
Yeah, well, you said it. So here's the final question. So is it true that this is the first of several other books that you plan to follow up? You told me it took 12 years to do this one, but you're ready to go to do more?
This is funny because I have a former dean here who's now at Columbia, who, when she heard about my plan, she said, "You'll be writing this in the rest home," which is probably the case. I will say that there was a third section to this book that we had to take out because of length. And so it sits alone now as its own standalone volume on the 85 years of Black women performing in and across and outside of and in contestation of Porgy and Bess. So that is the next volume, and then we'll see how we're doing with the rest home.
Well, people are so dazzled by what you had to say. No one has a direct question to you. So I am delighted to thank you for all that you've given us in this book. This is one of my favorite events, and it's because of work as the kind that you have produced that just makes me so excited. So I thank you so much for being and joining us here tonight, and thank all the audience for being here with us tonight as well. I also want to thank the Edward R. M. Kennedy Institute for the U.S. Senate, the Stone Foundation, the Boston Foundation, the Honorary Committee, the fabulous jurors, the authors, and you, our viewers, for joining us tonight. Have a good night.